morning. There we go. Well, I woke up with a sore throat this morning. It's okay. It's allergies. Anybody else suffer from spring? Am I the only one? No. Okay, good. Thank you. And I almost hit a turkey on the way here this morning. So thanks for the prayers this morning. Lisa prayed with me this morning, so I appreciate it. So I hope you all had a great week of digging into your workbooks. Are you finding Leviticus a little less intimidating? A little bit? Good, good. That's one of our goals, is to get you into a book that maybe you've avoided. So just for a quick review, in your homework this week, you learned a little bit more about the book of Leviticus. And we took another look at what it means that God is holy. And the songs this morning were perfect. I kept thinking about it this morning. And we saw that the sacrificial system was God's good design for reestablishing relationship with his people, which pointed to that scarlet thread that we talked about last week, who is Jesus. We looked at Holy Convocation, which was one of my favorite parts of studying this thing, was this idea of God calling his people together for these feasts. And why it remains important for us today as Christians. Remember, the book is written to them. It's not written to us, but it's written for us. And we spent 2 days exploring a little bit about the Sabbath. And this morning, we're going to consider the Sabbath a little bit more, a little deeper. Now, there's disagreement among Christians and Christian scholars whether we need to obey any part of the Old Testament law, and that includes keeping the Sabbath day. And personally, the more I studied this idea of the Sabbath day, this command of God, I think it's something God still desires for us. And dare I say, requires. And we'll look a little bit into that as we go along. But we heard from Michelle last week that the law is good, and it's purposeful, and it reflects the character of the lawgiver, who is God. And so from your homework, you discovered that the law's goal, again, was to restore this relationship. And this applies to the Sabbath day as well. So the Sabbath day was made for who? Man, right. The Sabbath day was made for man, so it exists to serve us. And it is good, and it's for our good. And its purpose is for our rest and for setting aside a time to regularly meet with God together. In the 10 Commandments, we see God's expectations of his people. From Exodus 20:9 and 10, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the seventh day and made it holy. So quickly, just 2 things I want you to catch from these verses is that notice who is supposed to rest. Your son, your daughter, your servants, the stranger that comes into your dwelling place. Even your livestock are supposed to rest. So it was something that was for the entire community. The second thing, and we're going to touch on this a little bit, is the reason for it. And that is because in 6 days, God, after the 6 days of creation, God rested. So my question then for you is, out of the 10 Commandments, which of them would we look at today and think we don't need to obey them? Okay? How about, you shall have no other gods before you? That would be a biggie, wouldn't it? How about, thou shalt not murder? How about, thou shalt not commit adultery? Nope. So I think, of course not. We wouldn't say that. So even though Jesus said he fulfilled all the law, he also said that not one jot or tittle of it will vanish, will pass away until all is fulfilled. So God's moral law is still in effect. You know, the first 4 of the 10 commandments deal with our relationship with him, and the next 6 deal with our relationship with each other, and you saw from your homework. Love God, love each other. That is the purpose of the law, is love. And we also saw in these verses that the Sabbath day is a creation ordinance. Okay, it began in the Garden of Eden, long before the Old Testament law was written in Exodus and Leviticus. So Sabbath began in the garden when God himself rested, and we'll explore that in a minute. So therefore, I really think God's law to keep the Sabbath day holy, and we'd study what holy meant, is still something God desires for us. Certainly the early church believed that as they met together in the temple on the Sabbath day. As you can see throughout the book of Acts, that was a regular practice. And then as the Sabbath day shifted from the Jewish Saturday observance to our Sunday Resurrection Day observance. And this is a tradition that continues today in most Christian denominations. So when God initiates those feasts that we're going to look at in the next 3 weeks in Leviticus 23, he sets the table with the Sabbath day. We see that the first feast, the Passover, which Bindu, are you covering that next week? Yep. Begins on the Sabbath day. And all the other feasts begin or end in relationship to the Sabbath day. And within those feasts, there are also Sabbaths with a small s, sandwiched between, where no ordinary work was to be done, and God invited his people to rest. The words Sabbath, rest, and do no work altogether are mentioned more than 20 times in just Leviticus 23. So what is God trying to tell them, and what is he trying to tell us? In keeping the Sabbath day, God wanted his people to remember that he's the creator of all that is good, that he's their covenant king, and by doing no work, he wanted them to remember that he is the one that blesses and provides and brings abundance. And he wanted them to imitate him by ceasing from their work, to sense the satisfaction and the rewards of their planting and their reaping, the refreshment of a job well done, and to take time to center their lives around him corporately in community. And I believe God's design hasn't changed much today. And we get to enjoy those same kinds of blessings. However, this morning, we're not gonna consider how to prepare for the Sabbath, what you should or shouldn't do on its seventh day of rest. There's lots of articles and podcasts out there that are readily available. There's lots of really neat articles on how to prepare, like what to do the day before and things like that. But we're not going to explore that today. And we're not going to do an exhaustive study. That would be, as I was preparing this, I was like, oh, I wish I had a week for each one of my points, but I don't. So the Sabbath day deserves study, and you guys can study it some more on your own. But today we're going to focus on 3 aspects of Sabbath rest as we look at the joy of Sabbath rest. The joy of God, the joy of Jesus, and our future joy. So let's look at the joy of God. And my hope is that you walk away with just a new perspective on the Sabbath day, which kind of fuels your own desire to make it part of the rhythm of your life and to make it a special day in your households. So the joy of God and Sabbath rest. As I mentioned before, the Sabbath was a creation ordinance. It began in the Garden of Eden. In Genesis 2, we read, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done and rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done." So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it, God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. In your workbook, you saw that the word rest used here is the exact same word throughout the whole Old Testament for the word Sabbath. So God took a Sabbath day. And in the noun form, it just means an intermission. And in the verb form, it means to cease or just stop working, just to stop working. And so we see right at the beginning of creation that God separates, sets apart, makes holy 1 day out of 7. And it says he rested. So I asked you in your homework what it meant that God rested. Did it mean that he was tired? And I gave you a little hint to think about some characteristics of God, some, what do they call those? Attributes, thank you, that would help you answer that question. And maybe you thought of his omnipotence, that he's all powerful, his immutability, that he doesn't change, which teaches us that God doesn't get tired. You know, his energy level doesn't go like this, and he doesn't need a granola bar in the middle of the day like we do. So the 6 days of creating the heavens and the earth didn't wear him out. He didn't need a spa day, a granola bar. He didn't need to go to one of the tropical islands he had just created. So what does it mean that he rested from all his work? And I think an understanding of the word work here will help us understand this. The Hebrew word carries with it the meaning of an artisan, artisanship or workmanship, or to manufacture something. So God's creation work was that of an artist. The divine artist drawing on a blank canvas on which he displayed his power, his glory, his wisdom, and his creativity. And there's also a reward element to this word work, that there was a reward after all this work. A quick read through the creation account of Genesis 1, we see this clearly demonstrated. God created out of nothing, just by the power of his word, a world that was beautiful, teeming with life, regulated by the celestial bodies. And I find it kind of ironic. We just had solar eclipse yesterday. And all was in preparation for his crowning creation, which was man. And we see that God is no abstract artist. He's no Jackson Pollock, just throws paint out there. God's world was ordered, well-ordered masterpiece, well-designed. And what did he call this when it was all done? He called it very good, right? So in the Garden of Eden, God rested on the 7th day. There was not one more plant or planet, furry critter or creepy crawly that would have made his creation any better or complete or any more beautiful. In the midst of that perfect world, God came to have fellowship with man. The word Shabbat, or Sabbath, is very closely related to the word Shevet, which means to abide. So we see the interconnection there of the Sabbath and abiding with God. And from this we can see that on that Sabbath day, God set aside for him to walk with Adam, to commune with Adam, and for Adam to enjoy with him all that he had created. God rested from all his labor with joy and deep satisfaction because all was good and perfect and beautiful in form and function. Now we see this, David extols the Lord often in the Psalms for the wisdom of creation. But there's one psalm where David says, this is Psalm 104:31, may the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works. And this is hearkening back to the days of creation, that the Lord rejoiced in his work. Charles Spurgeon, the old 1800 preacher who I love, wrote of this verse that God delighted in his works at the first, when he rested on the 7th day and saw that everything was very good. This verse is written in the most glowing manner. The poet finds his heart is gladdened by beholding the works of the Lord, and he feels that the Creator himself must have felt unspeakable delight in exercising so much wisdom, goodness, and power. And we can see this demonstrated in other parts of the scripture in a very unlikely place, and that would be the book of Job, chapters 38 to 41, where God revisits and recounts his work of creation to Job. And he challenges Job with these words: "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? And what were its bases sunk? And who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Now, I used to read, this comes at the end of the book of Job, after all of Job's suffering and Job's lamenting, if you will. And I used to come to these chapters and read it as if God was scowling and scolding and maybe even angry at Job, And it's clear that God's rebuking Job and setting the record straight about who's in charge here. But he also takes Job on this joyful journey as he recounts everything that he's created. When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God, which were the angels, shouted for joy. This sounds like a celebration to me. And for 4 lengthy chapters, God triumphantly and joyously recounts his creation from the depths of the seas to the heights of the stars. From the storehouses of snow to the torrents of rain, he rejoices over the planets, the lightning, the lion, and the raven, and he recounts the majesty of the horse and the folly of the ostrich. And as he finishes, he spends one whole chapter, 34 verses, on just one creature, Leviathan, who, when you read it, sounds suspiciously like a fire-breathing dragon. And as you read, you cannot help but feel God's joy in what he's created. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the hosts of them, so that God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all his work that he had done in creation. This is the joy of God in Sabbath rest, his utter delight in what he had accomplished. Now, I have a recipe from the 1800s. It's an old family recipe for Stullen. And for those who don't know what Stullen, don't have a German background, it's this gooey, yummy, yeasty bread full of nuts and fruit, and it's a really time-intensive endeavor. You've got to soak the fruit overnight in rum or orange juice. You grind the almonds, you grate the oranges and the lemons, and chop up all that sticky fruit. And the recipe that I have makes 6 loaves. So you can imagine the challenge of kneading all that dough. In fact, my husband and I have to take turns. And the biggest challenge for me is always getting it to rise, because that's a lot of dough to rise. And I've attempted the recipe several times throughout the years with varying degrees of success. But one year, oh boy, the bread turned out perfectly. I mean, I beamed from ear to ear with pure joy and great delight and satisfaction, and I stepped back from all my labors. I rested and simply enjoyed what I had created, along with a great deal of butter. And it was very good. You see, as image bearers, we take after our God. We are co-creators with him. Now, of course, we don't create as he did out of nothing, but we do use the things he created to be creative. And we imitate him whenever we make something useful, beautiful, something that reflects his character and brings him glory. And when we step back in satisfaction and rest of a job well done, whether it's the completion of a baby blanket, a song or a poem you may have written, a bountiful garden, we're coming up on gardening season, yay, a delicious loaf of Stullen, or any of the hundreds of ways that we create, we too can experience this joy of Sabbath rest as we imitate our Creator God. I find it so interesting that we're doing this thing on April 26th, this, what is it called? Taste and something? All these different, like Bindu said, all the different ways that we're gifted here creatively, and we just find joy in that, don't we? And there's rest in that. But as we know, this joy of Sabbath rest in the garden didn't last forever. Instead, our foreparents, Adam and Eve, when tempted by the evil one disguised as a serpent, neglected to chop off his head. Instead, they listened to him, disobeyed the Creator, and plunged the world and humanity into chaos and death. God's perfect, complete, shalom-filled world became unraveled, soiled, disordered, a place where God's fellowship with man was broken and the peace of Eden was shattered. And in the very next chapter of Genesis, we read of the first murder. And with each chapter, unfolding chapter, the world becomes increasingly evil, up to the days of Noah, where it is written, "The Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart." God's joy was turned to grief, and with it ours as well. And mankind has been restless ever since, with the restlessness that comes from being separated from our Creator. Yet the goal of God's work from there on out was to restore that lost Sabbath rest. The Bible's redeeming theme is one continuous movement from this restlessness to restoration. And right here in Genesis 3, in the midst of curses and pronouncements of judgment, God promises that dragon slayer who would restore our peace, our rest, and our relationship with him. He says to Satan, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, you shall bruise his heel." And from the moment Jesus arrives in Bethlehem, Satan began to nip at his heels. We see it in Herod's edict to kill all those baby boys, in Satan's temptations of Jesus in the wilderness. We see it in the relentless accusations of the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders, and the taunting of the demons he cast out, and the abandonment and betrayal of his own disciples. And most of all, we see it in his torture, death, and separation from his Father on the cross. But with his victorious resurrection, Jesus bruised that serpent's head in anticipation of the day when he would lop it off completely. He would finish the job that Adam should have done. Which brings us to then the joy of Jesus. Jesus' sacrificial work on the cross is finished. His very cry on the cross was, "It is finished." And like God in the garden, he too steps back, receives his reward for his finished work, which resulted in the end of that complicated sacrificial system we took a look at, and the ransom of his people for himself, a holy people set apart as his reward, and seated at the right hand of God, Jesus rests. But there's more. As in the creation of all things in the Garden of Eden, Christ too is an artist, an artisan, a workman. Through his act of redemption, he also created something new in which he too rejoices. Listen to these verses. "If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away, the new has come. We are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives within me." As believers, we are his new creation, a creation that he takes Sabbath joy in and delights in, as God did in the Garden of Eden. In Hebrews 12, we're told to look to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. So what was that joy that was set before him that enabled Jesus to endure such sufferings? Certainly, it was the joy of having done his Father's will. We see over and over in the Gospel of John, "I'm here to do my Father's will. I'm here to do my Father's will." Securing the redemption of his people. Certainly, it was the joy of resurrection, ascension, the reunion with his Father in heaven, the reinstatement of his full glory and majesty. And it is also most certainly the joy he has over us, his new creation. In the Old Testament prophecy of Zephaniah, we see this joy foreshadowed as we read, "He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will quiet you by his love. He will exalt over you with loud singing." As the Gospel Transformation Bible comments on this verse, sin, death, and hell are vanquished. You've been walked by grace into the green pastures and still waters of restored fellowship with God, who does not simply put up with you, but in fact sings over you. He sings over us. This is the joy of Jesus in Sabbath rest. And this is the joy of Sabbath rest that we have today because what Jesus has done. When we put our faith in him, we can rest from trying to save ourselves through the endless, restless works we thought might do but could never do what Jesus has done. It is by his work that we have rest, that we can again abide with him, and that we have peace. As his new creation, we can rest from all those pesky existential questions. You know what they are. Why am I here? Who am I? What's my purpose in life? They're all answered in the resurrected wounds of Jesus. As the Israelites who were delivered from Egypt, we too are a new creation with a new identity. And if you've never put your faith in Jesus, your Redeemer, the one who paid the penalty for your sin, please come and talk to any one of us, and we'd be happy to talk with you and pray with you. But there's more. The Sabbath day was a rehearsal. For the Jewish people, it was a rehearsal of the Messiah to come and the rest that would be found in this final deliverer. And for us, it's the eternal rest to come when Jesus returns. There's an eternal rest waiting for us because this isn't the end of the story. Aren't you glad that this is not the end of the story? We live now between two worlds, between the now and the not yet. And we need to keep our eyes focused, not just on the now, but on the not yet. Hebrews 4:9 tells us there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. The word remains in the Greek means reserved. Reserved. There's a Sabbath rest that awaits us. It's reserved for us. It's got our name on it. This is yours. When Jesus returns and all things are restored. As John Sidema puts it in his book, I forgot the name of it, sorry, it's probably on the slide. We already taste rest. We already taste it, but we haven't been seated at the table for the full feast. Yes, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. While we can rest now in God's finished work, Jesus reminds us in the Gospels that in this world you will have trouble. Sometimes life is filled with so many trials, we begin to doubt there will ever be a happily ever after. We often feel weary of all the evil that is in this world. Don't you just feel that heaviness at times? It just seems to get worse and worse with each passing year. And we begin to doubt that it's ever going to be taken care of. And if we're honest with ourselves, we get tired of fighting our own sins over and over again. And like the Apostle Paul, we cry out, "Oh, wretched person that I am." And many of us, I know many of you here, carry scars that will never be healed this side of heaven. One of my favorite books is the Lord of the Rings trilogy. You can call me a geek, it's okay. I've read them 3 times, and I'll probably read them again. But in The Return of the King, we find that Frodo carried the pain of the stab from the Witch King back to Hobbiton with him. It never completely healed. And at one point he says to Gandalf, "I am wounded with knife, sting, and tooth, and a long burden. Where shall I find rest?" And I don't know about you, but I often feel like Frodo, heavy burden with wounds that just can't quite heal completely, longing for the gray havens. But it's at times like these that I need to be reminded that during his earthly ministry, with every healing, with every demon that was cast out, that every dead person, I just read about Lazarus this morning in my quiet time, every dead person brought to life, Jesus was undoing the curse. He was giving us a foretaste of what was to come, encouraging us to continue to look and hope that that kingdom will be restored and we will be seated at that table with him. There remains for us an eternal Sabbath. It's reserved for us. C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity writes, "If I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world." Do you ever have desires that just can't be met by the cheap offerings of this world? Do you ever feel like you were just made for something else, for another world? Well, you were. And it was called Eden. And it's been temporarily usurped, but have no fear. Jesus has defeated the enemy. Remember, this is God's story. He's the author, and he's not written a tragedy that leaves us feeling empty and untethered. Instead, like all the truly great stories, the ones that are really worth reading, God has written one that leaves us feeling satisfied and whole, and it will end in happily ever after. Because he's not done creating. As it says of Jesus' return in Revelation 21, behold, I'm making all things new. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. And just like in Eden at the first, God will again dwell not just within us by his Spirit, but with us. With us. We will be with him. The Apostle John goes on in Revelation to tell us that we have an eternal rest from every sad goodbye caused by death, all mourning and weeping, all pain, pestilence, and disease, and best of all, an eternal rest from our ever-persistent sins. Our sanctification will be complete. All evildoers will be banned from God's presence, for there will be no more unrighteousness. If that doesn't bring you joy, I don't know what will. What Jesus started here on earth, he will finish. There will be Sabbath. There will be Shalom. There will be Shabbat, ours forever. So the practice of a weekly Sabbath day is a foretaste of what's waiting for us. Now is the time to sample the joy of the eternal Sabbath to come. It is no wonder that the Sabbath day is mentioned within the first chapters of Genesis. No wonder it's the fourth of the 10 Commandments. It's no wonder to me that the Lord's appointed feast began with the keeping of it. It was always meant to give us hope and to point us to Jesus. It's God's gift to us. And as you know, the religious leaders of the day had turned the Sabbath day into an onerous task, adding just heaps and heaps of qualifications on God's one simple command: remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Over the years, the rabbis, get this, they added 39 different categories, just categories of things that you could and you couldn't do on the Sabbath. So you see why I don't even want to go down that road of telling you what you should and shouldn't do on the Sabbath day. But as we've seen, the Sabbath day was meant to be a joy and a delight. Isaiah 58:13 and 14 says, keep the Sabbath, and this is from the New Living Translation, which I don't often use, but I kind of like this. Keep the Sabbath day holy. Don't pursue your own interests on that day, but enjoy the Sabbath. Speak of it with delight as the Lord's holy day. Honor the Sabbath in everything you do on that day, and don't follow your own desires. Then the Lord will be your delight. Taking delight in a Sabbath day is taking delight in God himself. It's a principle and an observance we still need today. In the pride of our own self-sufficiency, we have a tendency to fill every waking moment with busyness. I think as women, we easily fall into this trap. Just finish this for me. If I don't do it, yeah, thank you, come on. Nobody can do it right anyway, so I'll just do it myself. And when we do, we feel overwhelmed with fatigue, and we tell ourselves that we need self-care, and we need a me-cation, and all the other things the world tries to tell us is going to help us out, none of which satisfies our deepest needs. Busy people, all people, men and women, young and old, need to hear from God, be still, and know that I am God. And busy people need to build into our lives this rhythm of a Sabbath rest that reorients and recenters our lives around a holy God. Observing this is not about our behavior or law-keeping. It's about our well-being. It's about our health, our spiritual health, our mental health, our emotional health. It's about our joy, our relationship with God. And whenever we meet in holy convocation. Now you know what that means. On Sunday mornings with our brothers and sisters, we're saying yes to Jesus' invitation to meet with him, to be refreshed with him. We're telling him that we value him above all else, and we're reminding each other to value him above all else. One of my favorite things is when we're singing on Sunday morning and the instruments drop out. Now, I love all the instruments, don't get me wrong, but when the instruments drop out and all of a sudden all your voices are being raised together in song, together, holy convocation, praising our Lord together. And I am literally taken into the heavens. It's like, and thinking of God sitting on his throne and Jesus sitting on the right hand of the Father and just taking joy in what we're giving him. That's what it's about. And whenever we take time to engage in Sabbaths with the small s, because there are giant S Sabbaths, which is the Sabbath day, and there are small S Sabbaths between the weekly Sabbath day. Whether it's a walk in the woods just this morning, I have a pair of bluebirds that are nesting in my backyard. And for me, that was just a tiny moment of Sabbath rest, of joy, just watching them and going in and out of the nesting box. Sometimes it's just a quiet morning with a Bible and a cup of coffee in your hand, no disturbances, or a dedicated time of prayer. We're saying yes again to Jesus' promise to come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest for your souls. We are telling him that he is the only one who can meet our deepest needs, along with our daily bread. In him, we rest from our works to gain salvation. We rest in remembering all he's done from creation to salvation. We rest in his presence from the weariness of life, and we remember that one day we shall go from partial rest to perfect rest. The Sabbath day is a rehearsal of the restoration to come. So let's take joy in it, as the Israelites did. The Sabbaths that we find within the Lord's appointed feasts are part of the storyline of God's redeeming love, for he and he alone can bring rest to a restless world. Through the feast, you will see in the next 3 weeks more fully how he will accomplish this. So get your appetites ready as we explore the Lord's appointed feast in the next 3 weeks, and keep your eyes open for the part that Sabbath plays in each one of those. I'm going to close with a prayer this is called Every Moment Holy. This is a series of really cool things. I really recommend these. So if you'd bow with me and we'll just pray this prayer with this. O Christ, our Sabbath, you have fashioned us to function best in rhyming lines of work and rest. Our relaxations and recreations, like unspoken invitations to that still great holiday to come, when all burdens will at last be shed and weariness be put to bed, and gladsome joys stretch endlessly before us. As you called your disciples to come away with you, Lord, retreating from the crush of crowds, pausing in their long work simply to rest, to reflect, to enjoy your company, your words, your conversation, to enjoy their fellowship with one another. So help us also to carve out spaces merely to be with you, to be together, to be refreshed. Amen.